Before the gavel, Mike Johnson's January 6th. History still matters. When Mike Johnson walks onto the House floor today, he does so holding the gavel of the Speaker of the House, one of the most powerful positions in American government. He controls the agenda. He shapes the debate. He decides what moves forward and what quietly disappears. But long before he held that gavel, long before the spotlight followed his every move, Mike Johnson played a role in one of the most controversial chapters in modern American history. And that chapter has a name: January 6th. This story isn't about shouting crowds or broken windows. It's not about viral images or dramatic footage replayed on cable news. From a legal and institutional standpoint, January 6th was also something else entirely. A coordinated attempt to challenge the outcome of a presidential election through formal legal and political channels. And Mike Johnson was part of that effort. January 6th didn't begin at the Capitol. Most people remember January 6th as a single day, a moment of chaos, a breach, a shocking rupture in American political norms. But from a legal perspective, January 6th was not spontaneous. It was the endpoint of weeks of preparation, strategy, and paperwork. It was the result of coordinated efforts to overturn the 2020 election using courts, legislatures, and congressional procedures. Before anyone marched on Washington, before anyone gathered outside the Capitol, Republican lawmakers were already working behind the scenes to invalidate certified election results. That's where Mike Johnson enters the story. The Texas lawsuit and the amicus brief. In December 2020, the state of Texas filed an extraordinary lawsuit with the U.S. Supreme Court. The request was unprecedented. Texas asked the court to throw out the election results in several other states, effectively invalidating millions of legally cast ballots. Legal experts across the ideological spectrum called the lawsuit deeply flawed. The Supreme Court rejected it outright. But before that rejection, the lawsuit received public backing from a group of Republican members of Congress. Mike Johnson was among them. He signed an amicus brief in support of the effort, a formal legal document urging the Supreme Court to consider the case. This wasn't a protest sign or a cable news appearance. It was a deliberate legal action taken by a sitting member of Congress. That distinction matters, because this wasn't about rhetoric. It was about process. It was about using the judicial system to overturn an election that had already been certified by the states. Why that matters legally? From a purely legal standpoint, signing that brief placed Mike Johnson on record supporting an effort to invalidate election results. The courts rejected the theory. The Constitution did not support the claim. The lawsuit failed, but the attempt itself became part of the historical record. Critics argue that January 6th cannot be understood solely through the lens of violence at the Capitol. It must also be understood as the culmination of legal and political strategies designed to stop the transfer of power, and those strategies didn't happen in a vacuum. After January 6th, the silence. In the aftermath of January 6th, many Republicans scrambled to distance themselves from the events. Some expressed regret. Others claimed they were misled. A few publicly acknowledged that challenging the election had been a mistake. Mike Johnson did not issue a clear public repudiation of his role in supporting the legal challenge. He did not frame it as an error in judgment. He did not openly reverse course. And that silence has become a focal point for Democratic criticism. Because in politics, what leaders choose not to say can matter as much as what they say loudly. From backbencher to speaker fast forward, the Republican Party descends into internal chaos. Speakers rise and fall. Leadership collapses under the weight of infighting. Eventually, Mike Johnson emerges, not as the party's first choice, but as the compromise candidate. The one who survives when everyone else fails. Suddenly, a relatively low-profile lawmaker becomes Speaker of the House, and with that promotion, his past becomes relevant again. because the Speaker is not just another politician. The Speaker is the institutional gatekeeper of the House of Representatives, the person responsible for enforcing norms, managing investigations, and upholding procedural integrity. That role Democrats' core argument. Democrats do not argue that Mike Johnson committed a crime on January 6th. They do not argue that he incited violence. Their argument is narrower, and in some ways more dangerous politically. They argue that someone who once supported efforts to overturn a presidential election should not be the person deciding how Congress responds to threats against democratic institutions. This is not a personal attack. It's an institutional warning. The Speaker decides whether subpoenas move forward. The Speaker controls committee priorities. The Speaker determines how aggressively Congress pursues accountability. And when the Speaker has unresolved ties to January 6th-era strategies, critics say that creates an inherent conflict. Power, silence, and accountability. Mike Johnson rarely speaks about January 6th today. He does not foreground it. He does not explain it. He does not revisit it. But critics argue that silence at this level of power is not neutral. They argue that refusing to reckon publicly with past actions allows those actions to quietly shape present decisions. This is where the conversation shifts from politics to governance, because democracy depends not just on rules, but on trust. Trust that leaders respect outcomes even when they lose. Trust that institutions will defend themselves when challenged. And January 6 tested that trust. The institutional risk from an institutional standpoint, this is the heart of the concern. Congress is not just a battlefield of ideas, it is also a self-policing body. It relies on leadership to uphold norms, enforce accountability, and draw red lines. When leadership itself is linked, however indirectly, to a previous attempt to overturn an election, critics argue the system becomes vulnerable, not because of malice, but because of incentives. If accountability threatens political allies, will it proceed? If transparency creates risk, will it be delayed? If investigations point too close to home, will they stall? These are not accusations, they are questions, and in politics, unanswered questions can be more corrosive than outright scandals. January 6th as a living issue. January 6 did not end when the Capitol was cleared. It did not end when Congress reconvened. It did not end when the votes were certified. It became a lens through which leadership decisions are now judged. Every time the Speaker delays an investigation, every time oversight stalls, every time accountability appears selective, critics point back to January 6th and ask whether the past is influencing the present. That is the shadow Mike Johnson carries, whether he acknowledges it or not. This is bigger than one man. This story is not just about Mike Johnson. It's about what happens when democratic norms are tested and partially survive. It's about whether institutions learn from those tests or quietly move on. And it's about whether leadership positions should come with a public reckoning for past actions that challenged foundational principles. Democracy does not require perfection, but it does require accountability. The final question: history is rarely interested in intentions. It does not ask whether someone meant well. It does not weigh private explanations. History asks simpler questions. Who stood where when the system was tested? Who defended outcomes, and who challenged them? Who accepted results, and who tried to reverse them? Mike Johnson now holds one of the most powerful roles in American government, and with that gavel comes a history that never fully closed. Closing, strong end. January 6th wasn't just a day, it was a stress test, and the people who participated in that test, through words, actions, or legal maneuvers, carry that record with them. Mike Johnson's rise did not erase January 6th, it brought it into the Speaker's office. End line. Leadership isn't just about what you control, It's about what you stood for when control was slipping away.